stupid thing does that I have it all set, and then I got to resize the stupid video just right there so we can see what we're talking about. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
And then you can join so we can see any comments coming through.
Yeah. Let's see.
We already have 2 people joined us. Well, I think. Oh, we have 1. We have you. You have joined us.
And then it looks like there's a Barbara maybe.
And Barbara's there. Hi, Barbara. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being there. So I'm Mike with Mortgage Solutions. Welcome to another Coffee with Mike. I'm here with Lashaya Abbott, not Fletcher, but Fletcher's on all your licensing and all your paperwork. So we had to, on all the written stuff, had to put Fletcher, but you just got married recently.
Yes.
Excellent. So Lashaya Abbott, but everything's documented that way. We had a great coffee last week kind of talking about this, the subject of real estate and mortgages. And you brought up the buyer's broker agreement right off the bat because it's a big, I'm not going to say contentious document, but it's a document that definitely isn't getting completed well. Can you explain on that for anybody who doesn't know what the buyer's broker agreement might be for and what it's needed as far as real estate?
Yes, absolutely. So the buyer broker agreement is required by the National Association of Realtors.
Mm-hmm.
It is something that it went into effect, I believe, I'm trying to think. It hasn't been, I think it's been a little over a year, but it is something that we are required to do. And there are some realtors that are not pushing it. And so that's kind of why we're talking about it today.
Right.
But pretty much it's important because it's starting those conversations right off the bat before any services are exchanged, like showing houses. We are pretty much talking about what to expect for compensation, who pays for that. Right. We also talk about what broker duties are expected from your realtor and what buyer is to expect throughout the whole transaction and going forward. We just also discuss the different options on those buyer broker agreements, how they can be exclusive relationships or it can be limited to just that particular property that you're signing it for. And so the realtor is trying to also protect themselves through these buyer broker agreements because there'll be times where you can show multiple properties and then that realtor could just, or that buyer could decide to just use a different realtor. And so this is kind of, if a realtor shows you that property, then that document is tied to that, to where that buyer would need to go ahead and use that realtor that address is tied to that document.
Right.
But really those conversations that are kind of lingering in the back of the buyer's brain, we're having those conversations up front. This way we can kind of have an understanding of what it looks like going forward.
So you said questions in the back of the buyer's brain. What kind of
up front? This way we can kind of have an understanding of what it looks like going forward.
So you said questions in the back of the buyer's brain. What kind of questions are they having, or what kind of questions would they have
going forward?
So you said questions in the back of the buyer's brain. What kind of questions are they having, or what kind of questions would they have that are being brought forward instead of the last minute? What questions are you talking about?
Yeah, so that so a big one could be compensation. Okay. Sometimes buyers could have an impression that the seller wraps the cost of compensation for both agents up in the sell price, and that can be the case. Right. And a lot of times buyers prefer that because sometimes they're barely able to afford this property, and so any extra fees could, push them over the edge. So we're just letting buyers know that that is not the case at all. Sellers don't have to wrap the compensation out of the sell price. Right. But so we're having that conversation because buyer may decide that they prefer to, do an offer on a property that only the seller is wrapping that cost up in there because they need that help.
Right. It's changing the stigma that comes, or maybe not the stigma, but the traditional mindset where a buyer, they wouldn't generally have to worry. Years ago, they wouldn't have to worry about both brokers and what their pay was, what their compensation was.
Right.
But we're bringing it to the forefront saying, hey, in some situations, some sellers aren't paying for the buyer's representation.
Right.
So with that, we have to be aware, this is how much these brokers are charging or how much their services are worth. And if we show you a property that's not paying the buyer's broker, you may have to come up with a fund. So it's having those awkward conversations up front, saying, hey, if this doesn't happen, I as a broker have to get paid, and this is what our compensation looks like. So that's major hurdle to get over. So it's not awkward later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions that may be in the back of a buyer's mind that, don't happen naturally in the process, or they may happen too late and then causes an issue? Any other questions you were thinking of as far as the buyer's broker agreement and bringing those questions to the forefront?
Yeah. Let's see. I think too, one of the other things is a buyer may not understand what's the benefit for them in signing one of those. And off the bat, if you have a realtor that is following the rules that they're supposed to be following, that looks good to a buyer, because you would want, a realtor that is going to follow the rules and look out for their best interest. And so if you have a realtor that's kind of already starting things off not really following that, that can be kind of, that might not be desirable for a buyer to have that type of representation by that type of professional. Right,
because you want somebody who's going to get you through that process, and you want someone who's going to do it ethically, correctly, and follow all the rules to get you the best outcome that they can. So starting off, if they're not requiring you to sign the buyer's broker as a buyer, if they're not requiring you to sign that one, they're already starting off skirting the rules, which may not help you in the long run, especially if something weird comes up. And they don't follow the rules to, how do I say this? Protect the buyer, or even compensate the buyer for anything that goes wrong in that transaction. So it's encouraging buyers to make sure that they are looking for the buyer's broker agreement and understanding what they're signing, so that way when they get connected with the realtor, they can say, no, I totally expect this. I'm going to sign it because I've decided to move forward. That does bring us to that next conversation. And we were actually just having a conversation with another realtor in the office about how people are calling in, and they're kind of asking for names, asking for interviews, so they can look at properties before they actually sign up with a buyer's broker. I mean, how are they able to do that? Or what's their technique there? As far as a person calling to talk to the listing agent of a property, like what's their goal there?
So a listing agent can show buyers their listing without that buyer broker agreement. So it is a little bit easier on that end, because the listing agent's goal is to get that buyer in to look at the home. They don't have to go search for a buyer's agent. They're trying to make it a little bit easier. So it's not necessarily required there. Because that agent is already committed to that listing agreement with that seller. So it is a way that buyers can look at the property without having any of those,
That seems risky though. Like, because if I'm the listing agent and I have a buyer that calls me to look at a house I'm listing, and then this buyer wants to make an offer, they're talking to me, who represents the seller. So it would be a good idea for that buyer to actually have their own buyer broker to help them make that offer. Because in my mind, you can't make everybody happy. So that's why a listing agent should be great at doing listings, and then a buyer's broker would help that buyer make an offer on that listing. And so there are situations where a listing agent can represent the buyer, as long as that buyer is comfortable with that realtor representing them and the seller. And then that would be called dual representation. Sometimes buyers are not comfortable with that, which is understandable. And so I definitely would recommend that buyer seek a realtor for their own representation. Now, when dual representation happens, where that realtor is representing both ends, they are still required to uphold their ethical duties, keep, that wall between this conversation and this conversation. But yeah, I do think that a buyer needs to do whatever feels most comfortable. And if they're having their own representation, that's something they're seeking, then definitely seek that out, because, some people need that layer of trust there. And that's how they'll seek it. So. And it just knows, in my mind, sometimes you're like, I need to know for sure that you have my best interest at heart. So.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned there was a couple of options on a buyer's broker agreement. It was something about properties, and then something about not specific properties. What's the difference there?
So there's two options on those buyer broker agreements. One is exclusive, and then one is it's just for that particular property you're showing.
Okay.
And so if you're doing just a BBA for this one property, then you're just signing with that realtor that if I decide to bring an offer on this one property, I'm going to have you represent me.
Okay.
But I may decide on a different property that I want this other realtor to show it to me. And so then they would need to make sure that they're also signing just that address for just that property with that realtor.
Okay.
Because the other selection on those buyer broker agreements is an exclusive representation where that particular realtor is representing you exclusively for the whole San Juan County.
Okay.
And that's perfectly fine too. That can also make things easier because if you're like, hey, this is my good friend, that's my realtor, I am only working with them, then it's easy. You would just sign that and that would make it a lot easier where you don't have to keep filling it out for every property.
Right. Okay. So. Got it. That makes sense. Perfect. Let's go to comments. Did you see any comments come through? We were actually streaming, so I didn't have to walk all the way over there. I don't know if I saw any come through just yet. Oh, you've got different ones skimming through. Let me see if I can do that then. Maybe it'll work this way. Let's check for some comments. I got to go slow. If I go too fast, then it gets weird. No, nothing yet. A lot of people in here. Well, if you have questions or comments about real estate, mortgages, buying, selling, I have a professional here. She can help us out. As far as the lending, I'm that professional. So you can ask those boring questions about lending because we all know lending is not fun. Real estate's fun. Lending is less exciting. Nothing yet.
I think I see one.
Okay.
What state are you in? So we're in New Mexico.
Correct. And that's really important because different states have different documents, but you had mentioned that the National Association of Realtors has made the buyer's broker agreement a requirement across the country. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So it's key to know that, there's a national push to make sure that all buyers and all sellers have clear distinction on who does what and what's happening.
Right.
Each state has different documents though. Each state has different contracts. I'm licensed in 22 states. My company's licensed in 45. There's a couple of states it's real tough to get licensed in as a lender, but
right.
We go from state to state and the same concerns, the same problems come up. Mm-hmm. So we'll interview different realtors and they'll have the same things that somebody from Florida has, that somebody in New Mexico has. And then this buyer broker agreement, it has come up as a new conversation. And it's still out there. We actually make it a requirement in many of our conditions that we have to have some version of the buyer's broker agreement showing what the buyer may or may not have to come to closing with, pending if they have to pay for any type of brokerage fees.
Gotcha.
So it is a big deal that I think sometimes gets kicked under the rug. That being said, you did mention that there are a lot of people that are actually utilizing it correctly. So it's going okay, but then there were still some situations where some realtors weren't pushing it, and that screws things up. I mean, what can that do for us as far as, I guess, the market is that okay, or what problems do you foresee if a broker is not pushing that right off the bat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you have some realtors that are not pushing that, then it can kind of cause, I would say, maybe a lack of trust with some of the buyers, because from their perspective, they're going to be like, oh, these realtors are not pushing it, but these ones are. What's the deal? Who should I guess, kind of trust kind of thing.
Okay.
And so it's kind of causing an unlevel playing field, because then you have realtors that are making things super easy. You don't got to sign this. Let's go look at this property. Like, that all sounds real great.
Sure.
But then once you have the other realtors that are actually doing what they're supposed to, then they're missing out on clients, because the ones that are not, quite following the rules are sweeping up clients because they're making it an easy process.
Right.
And
they're not doing the hard stuff up front.
Yeah, which looks great, but really it's like those buyer broker agreements are not only to protect buyer and realtor, but it's really good conversations that you should be having at the beginning, just so you just have a straightforward path and you know what to expect.
Right.
And there's no hidden this or that. And so I do think that it's doing a disjustice to the buyers whenever realtors are not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And it may be an uncomfortable topic. It may be one of those things that kind of brings people back down to earth, and it pulls them out of the dream of buying a house, because they envision, I want to look at houses, I have an idea down to earth, and it pulls them out of the dream of buying a house, because they envision, I want to go look at houses, I have an idea, it may come up. And they're really uncomfortable conversations, probably. Why do you think it's so uncomfortable when it's going to happen that way every time? You will have a transaction that has to happen with buyers, with sellers. Why would it be such a difficult conversation, do you think?
I think comfortable when you don't quite know a realtor, because you're meeting this professional for the first. At first, it can be uncomfortable when you don't quite know a realtor, because you're meeting this professional for the first time. That we're also having these similar conversations on the selling side. So it's not just buyers that are having this conversation. When we do a listing with sellers, we're also expressing that what it like if they didn't offer compensation for buyer's agent, and how that can lessen their buying pool because they're not offering that service wrapped up in the sale price, which a lot of these homes that are being sold, I mean, I don't know the statistics, these homes that are being sold, there's quite a bit of them that they're selling, and the compensation is being wrapped up in that sale price for both realtors. And so they're selling, and the compensation is being wrapped up in that sale price for both realtors. And so I think that, having those conversations on the selling side and buying side is just helping to create a good flow. And so I think that, having those conversations on the selling side and buying side is just helping to create a good flow. And I think we're all trying to just move forward and help mind sellers and buyers. That's why these broker agreements were created, is to have these conversations up front. So this way, nobody has an expectation going forward that seller's going to cover it or buyer's just going to cover it, or what it's going to look like. So. Well,
in the lending field, it's real similar. And we've, when the industry crashed back in 2008, a ton of reform came in, and a lot of new documentation came through that we had to disclose a lot more information up front. And fees were disclosed, but I had just gotten into the industry in 2009, and some of the horror stories where it just wasn't up front, it wasn't clear on the lending side. I was like, how did people approve this? How did customers continue to go through with this? And there was no regulation. So the regulation that came through required us to disclose a lot more information. And in my mind, coming in new, I was like, that makes sense. Here's truly what everything's going to cost.
Yeah.
There's some movement. There's some different things that can change. It was a conversation piece.
Right.
It was a little bit more, I guess, concrete than maybe the buyer's broker agreement, where it says, hey, this might happen.
Right.
But on our documentation, it was, hey, some of these things may change. Here's the true things to watch out for. Here's some other things that we have no control over, and we're going to try to predict our fees as best we can.
Right.
And I think having those upfront conversations and not being intimidated by documents, it builds trust. It allows people to know, okay, I know you're looking out for me. I know you're watching for it. I even have people call me and say, hey, what's this document you sent me? I said, this is called the loan estimate. And it showed something that changed. It could have been any number of things. When maybe we changed the loan amount, maybe we changed the interest rate. These are things that have changed. And if you weren't aware of the change, it's a conversation piece. It's why am I getting this document? What is this change for?
Right.
Same thing with the buyer's broker agreement, and maybe even your listing agreement, where it says, hey, here's all the information that I can best predict right now.
Absolutely.
It's all a conversation to make sure we can move forward.
Yep.
Now, I remember when we were talking, you had discussed that the buyer's broker agreement is not a commitment, or it's not as long of a commitment. And we had a weekend. I think Easter was there, so all of us are real tired.
Yeah.
Especially those of us with children's. But how did we come across that? I mean, it's a document, not quite a contract, but kind of a contract. What did we settle on as far as that statement of it's not a full commitment? Right.
It's more of protecting. It is a way to protect the realtor.
Okay.
And like I mentioned, the address that's on there, you have a conversation with that buyer, let them know like, hey, this property we're going to go look at today. this will protect me from my time showing you the property today. And so if you do decide you're interested, then you need to make sure you contact me so that we can drop the offer up, because that is what that it is a contract. So it is saying that you are going to have that realtor represent you for that property they showed you.
Right.
Now there has been cases in the past where a buyer has had filled out multiple of these with different realtors, and they didn't understand what they were being, the realtor wasn't breaking it down. So the buyer really didn't understand the type of commitment in that particular document, like whether it was exclusive representation or just for that property. And so there's times where I had buyers send it to me so I can look at it, and the realtor, that buyer just didn't know. So those are very important, that a buyer does know what they're signing. And if your realtor is not explaining it to you, like, make sure you're asking them questions or, pointing at certain things, because it is their job to explain it to you. You should know what you're signing before you sign it.
Right.
And so it can be a fully, binding contract exclusively, or it's just per that property.
Per that one property. Okay. Got it. So it's not a commitment every time, but you have to read the document all the way through, ask questions. What does this really mean? What is it? And personally, the responsible, don't worry about that document, or it's not a big deal. It's not a great response.
Right.
If there's not an explanation behind it, probably. So
there should always be some type of conversation.
Right. Why does this document exist? What is it meant for? And that, I encourage that even with our loan disclosures. We have a stack that high if it's, wet signed. Nobody wet signs that often anymore. But, you start flipping through it and you start clicking and signing. Some of those documents are key, and you need to pay attention to what they're for, ask those questions, and that could be part of your first milestone of trusting who you're talking to. Because if they can explain that document, then you can have that level of trust of, okay, they know what they're talking about. They're confident in what they're doing. So it helps me trust that we can move forward. They have my best interest at heart.
Absolutely.
So, excellent. Any questions on your end? Any questions that you see?